it's now clicked over to 5 o'clock Western Australian time and 9 o'clock UK time, and we may have people from other time zones. Welcome everybody to the first 2024 event for Engage with Developmental Language Disorder. Just in case there are people who are not yet sure who Engage with Developmental Language Disorder is, I'm going to just give you a quick 4-minute rush through. And on this very first slide, you can see that there is a web link that you may choose to click on right now, or you might just notice what it is, Engage with Developmental Language Disorder, so you can have a look later. But I don't know why. Yeah, okay. And this is exactly what's happening. So I'm going actually now to my very first slide. Today, in our very first talk of 2024, we're super privileged to have the most amazing Laura Glisson, who's going to talk to us about her passion, which is narratives, and how narratives are so important for communication, with a particular focus on supporting children and people with DLD to tell stories and why DLD is so important. This event is being hosted by Engage with DLD, which has members of the team from Curtin University here in Western Australia. It was founded by Michelle Sinclair from the University of Bath and Nikki Botting from City University in London. And we also have Jenny Gibson from University of Cambridge, and the other person who works over here in Curtin University with me is Dr. Emily Jackson. So we are the team, and we have a placement student. Our current one is the amazing Ellie Barker, who's organised this, and there's a list of previous placement students on the screen. So we are the team. And this is the slide I had up before. We do have a website, so if you're not yet familiar with Engage with Developmental Language Disorder, pop onto the website and have a look. You can have a little poke around, find some research summaries, find out what we do. But essentially, what do? We are the first international database of individuals with DLD, and we target our recruitment for parents of children with DLD under the age of 16 and individuals with DLD who themselves are over 16. And we advertise ethically approved projects in the area of DLD and PPI, which is people involvement, I think. I can't remember, it's an English term. Over here, we would call it consumer informed or consumer focused, consumer involved research. So EDLD is trying to engage with parents of children with DLD and individuals and putting them in touch with researchers. We do that through our monthly or our quarterly research emails and our newsletters. EDLD researchers can request data from us if it's ethically approved. We will follow through with that. But the kind of data that we have, when a family signs up with us, here on the left, we collect some information about them, some demographics. It's all de-identified, but we do collect this information. And we also send out a yearly survey, and the actual questions we ask are dependent on the age of the people. So obviously the questions we might ask about 6-year-olds is different to the questions we would ask of our adults. And I'm not going to go into enormous details, but I'm just going to tell you that since we've been going in the last 3 years, we've actually advertised 41 research projects from 31 different researchers. We currently have 295 EDLD members in our database, of whom 258 are parents and 37 are individuals over the age of 16. So you can just really quickly see that we have people from all over the world, and that's why we're very proud to call ourselves an international database. And for our adults, we only have 37 so far, and interestingly, we have more females than males, but we also have people from all over the world who are members of our database, and these people feed into our database. We are on social media, and Ellie has really got us going with even more social medias. Some of these I'm not a member of, and those of you that know me would be laughing because you know that I love a little bit of social media. But we have a lot of different places that you can follow us or engage with us. If you've got your phones there now, you could quickly go to that QR code, which will take you to Linktree, and it will have all of these. Otherwise, you can just go straight onto our Engage with DLD webpage after today's talk and have a look. So that really is me. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to hand over to the amazing Laura Glisson, who is going to talk to the 80 odd people that are already here, Laura.
Okay, fantastic.
Laura and I go back a very long way. We've done research together. We have collaborated together. We've worked clinically together. We've taught together. So I've been really privileged to follow Laura's journey as an amazing practitioner. I'll let you introduce yourself, Laura, in terms of what you do and what you've done. But narrative is her passion project, and Laura knows more about narrative than most of us put together. So I'm super excited to hear this, Laura. So I'm going to mute myself now and hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Can I just check that you can see my slides? Yep. Beautiful. Okay. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to the E-DLD team for inviting me here today to talk to you about narrative. As Sue said, narrative is my passion, and I'll give a little bit of an overview as to why. And Sue, just at any point, please just let me know if there's anything that I need to stop, go back over, if there are any questions coming up. The main issue for me will be keeping to time today, because I could talk about narrative for weeks at a time. But the session for today is entitled Oral Narratives in School-Age Children, and my aim for today is to answer two questions. Why is it important? Why do we care about narrative and storytelling in school-age children and young adults and adults? And what kind of difficulties children with DLD might experience when they go to tell a story, and also what we can do to support students in the home, in the clinic, and at school. This doesn't seem to be, hold on 1 second. It's not clicking for me, give me 2 secs. Okay, so before I start, I would just like to acknowledge that I'm currently in the Noongar Nation in WA, in Western Australia. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which I live and work, which is the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and all the traditional custodians of the land in which we're in today. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also extend that respect to any other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who might be with us today, or any traditional owners and custodians of the land where you might be today. So as Sue said, she's known me for quite a while. I've been practicing now for just over 13 years, and I've been really, really fortunate to work across a number of different contexts: clinical, consultative, professional learning, capacity building and research roles. So I've got a little bit of a slide about the people and the communities and organisations that have had an impact on me, from private practices through to the Language Development Centre, one of the 5 language development centres here in Perth, Northeast LDC, where I started as a clinician and started getting interested in narrative and storytelling, all the way through to enrolling in my research with Suze and Dr. Mary Clayson, then moving over to the UK for 3 years during COVID times, which wasn't ideal, but it happened. And I worked for 3 years at Morehouse School and College, where I was really fortunate to work with upper primary and secondary age, all the way through into college age, with students with diagnosed DLD, alongside incredible clinicians, but also the Research Institute, headed by Dr. Susan Ebbels. And then when I returned back to Perth, another amazing private practice where I learned a lot from the clinicians and the directors of the practice. And now I work across the range of different sort of roles and wear a few different hats in WA, where my main focus and passion is about translating research evidence into practice for both classroom teachers and speech pathologists. So wear a number of different hats in that space. But all of these places together have kind of given me an interest in narrative and storytelling. It all started back in 2010 when I worked in the LDC, and we had an oral narrative program where students were telling stories and they were getting really good at telling stories. I also worked with mainstream schools who were implementing our oral narrative program, and I noticed that the schools that focused on narrative and storytelling, as opposed to other areas of oral language as their priority area, I was seeing like sort of more system-wide change in those students. So I was seeing improved vocabulary, comprehension, grammar, and reading comprehension. So it kind of got me thinking, is this a really efficient, effective, and functional way to target language development for mainstream and children with difficulties? And so that's when I enrolled in my narrative research. Working with older students, I can see again at Morehouse the impact that narrative difficulties can have on children as they tell stories or as they struggle to tell stories, and started to see more about the impact on mental health and things like they're telling their own story, talking about their own experiences. So it just validated for me that narrative is really, really important. I'm going to be presenting on my Master of Philosophy research project, which was supervised by Associate Professor Suze Chow and Dr. Mary Glisson, and also Rosemary Simpson, who at the time was the principal at Northeast LDC. I would like to acknowledge as well Dr. Samuel Calder and Cindy Sterling, speech pathologists who I worked with, who helped with data analysis, data entry, and inter-rater reliability, and also all of the participants, so my pilot and trial schools and WA Department of Education here in Western Australia. And then also want to acknowledge the wider LALIC team, the research gang here in Curtin, and that I sort of draw on a lot of the things that they have done around research and around school age language and literacy. And so I'll be drawing a little bit on that today. The outline of the session is, I'm going to start off by talking about what narrative is, why it's important, and what challenges people with DLD face. Then give a brief overview of our study and the findings, and then signpost to the ONIT, which is a freely available intervention that came out as a product of that study. And then just talk more broadly about what does the research tell us now, since I completed this study, around what we should and could be doing to facilitate narrative language in young children. I just wanted to get a sense though of the sort of spread of speech pathologists versus teachers. So I'm just pulling up the polls and quizzes. So if you wouldn't mind, I think Michelle has popped out a poll. It says, who are you? So I'm just looking at that. I can see that we've got 72% SLTs or SLPs, speech language pathologists, a couple of researchers, 12%, got some students, some teachers, and we've got a parent of a child with DLD, so 5 parents, which is fantastic. So thank you very much for joining us today. I really hope I can cater for everybody's needs and just give you at least 1 or 2 things that you can do at home, at school, and in the clinic, but also just point you towards where to get further information. All right. So let's have a little look. What is narrative? What do I mean when we talk about narrative? Well, basically it's this ability to tell or retell a series of causally related events in a sequence that makes sense and include all of the relevant information around character, around setting, and some kind of central plot or theme. So some really important things are there. It's this ability to produce or retell a story, but they're causally related. So the events are related to each other. One thing leads to the next, leads to the next, and that it's centered around this main character that drives the plot, right? So there's someone or something that has feelings and emotions around an event that happens. And I want to acknowledge as well that even though I'm talking about narrative today, there are also other genres or text types. So there are other text types like persuasive, how to tell someone which thing is better than another, informative text, which maybe provide information about dinosaurs or animals or specific events in the past, procedural text, so how to retell making a cake or making pizza or giving someone instructions of how to do something, expository, and also things like personal recounting events. So those text types or genres are all really important as well for children and for us to learn to develop in terms of production and comprehension. But for today, I'm going to be honing in on the narrative side of things, the fictional side of things, and telling stories about characters or people. The other thing to acknowledge is that narrative and discourse, so these different things, persuasive information, have 2 big components, comprehension and production. So we need children to be able to understand a story and to be able to listen to or read or watch a movie and be able to talk about and understand what's happened in the story and create this idea of the sort of the story that's occurred, who the character was, how they felt, what happened first, next, after the other. And we also have the production side of things. So to be able to tell a story and talk to someone about something that happened, or a book or a story that they've read or heard about, and inform that person about what happened and give them enough detail so they understand what the story is about. For the purpose of today, I'm going to try as best as I can to sort of signpost when it's comprehension versus production, but it's really hard to tease these two things out. And my research project actually led to improvement in both comprehension and production, which was really fantastic to see. So we know that when we provide instruction or intervention in narrative or any language area, we're looking at both comprehension and production all the time. But just to acknowledge that there are these two kind of big components. Okay, so when it comes to a narrative and other text types as well, we can organise narratives or text structures into two big things. So we've got a macro structure and a micro structure. The macro structure is this big overarching organisational pattern that a text follows. So every text type has its own macro structure. In a narrative, in a story, our text structure in the Western style narrative follows a particular formulaic structure, right? So we've got a setting, the beginning, we've got a middle, and we've got an end. But in the beginning of the story, we actually have to make sure that we're providing enough information about who the story is. So we're going to introduce the character, we're going to introduce the time and the place, when and where the story started. We're then going to have some kind of middle of the story, and in the middle of the story, we usually have some big event that happens to make the character want to do things. So it's usually a problem or something exciting that sort of starts them off. And this big thing, we call it an initiating event. It then leads to the character having a feeling about that event and then being motivated to do something about that event. So we have our internal response, our feeling and our plan. And then we have a series of actions, often in time order, but sometimes it might go back and forth in time. So we have our initiating event, the character feels or thinks something, and they go off and do it. And then finally, we come back to the end where there's some kind of resolution or the problem is fixed, and then there might be a consequence, like a moral or a feeling that they have at the end. So that's one episode. We can have a story with just this one episode, and then we can have stories with multiple episodes, or we can have stories that go back and forward in time. I'm rewatching Game of Thrones at the moment, and there are so many storylines occurring in Game of Thrones. It's so hard to sort of keep track of it, right? So we can have super simple narrative that follows the structure, or a very complex narrative that follows the same structure but repeated. So we've got this big overarching structure, the macro structure, which is important for students to know. And then we have all the stuff that goes in it, the meat on the bones. And this is where we have to be able to use specific types of sentences to describe what's happening in the story. Just through the very nature of telling a story, and we're talking in the past about things that have happened in the past, and explaining or describing someone to something who wasn't there, to someone who wasn't there, we are going to use more complex language. We need to use more complex sentences. We're going to be including things like adverbial phrases. So when, where, and how did the story occur? You know, all of a sudden, which would be an adverbial phrase, and we've got very carefully he crept around the doorway. So very carefully is that adverbial of manner. We're going to be describing how, when, and where the character does things. So lots of complex language starts to come out within a story. Aside from the grammar and the sentence structure, we also need to have really complex vocabulary. We need to be specific in the types of words we use. We need to use adjectives and specific verbs and specific nouns to really create a picture of what the character is doing. So narrative is complex. It relies on lots of different language areas. Sorry, it's kind of skipping forward. I'm going to keep trying to bring it back. It's complex. It relies on good vocabulary. It relies on good grammar, and it also relies on this understanding of how a story is structured. That doesn't mean, though, that we develop vocabulary and grammar first, that we need to target and address vocabulary and grammar first. In actual fact, we can target grammar and vocabulary through the context of storytelling, which is what a lot of the research is telling us now and what my project showed. Okay, so narrative is really important. It's really complex. It does develop over time. So we might have even little 2-year-olds going to string together like Daddy, me went park or go park. That might be an early narrative. Me and Daddy went to the park today, right? All the way through, and there's different stages of narrative development. But something that came out of the literature was that there's this really critical age between the ages of 5 and 6 where children are developing this mature narrative, okay, the macro structure. And what that means is that they have a character, a central character, they have some kind of setting, and the character goes on an adventure, does something. There's some kind of critical event at the start that makes them do something and an ending. So it's actually quite complex, quite a lot that 5-year-olds, typically developing 5-year-olds, can do, but also a really important part of development and when we need to provide lots and lots of instruction in a classroom context. So that's kind of really important to consider. But that also means that lots of children can have difficulties because it is a really complex language skill. And these oral narrative difficulties are really, really well documented in the literature. We've got children with developmental language disorder, children with language disorder associated with other conditions, ADHD, autistic students, etc., who are going to have likely to have narrative difficulties. We also see it occurring a lot in our low socioeconomic areas with our students from impoverished backgrounds, where they might come to us not having heard lots of stories, and so they have a limited narrative knowledge. And then also we see this population of linguistically and culturally diverse background students who might come to us with different types of narratives or different structures that they've heard. And so there's lots of populations that are at risk of developing, having narrative difficulties. The specific kinds of things you might see when a student is having difficulty at that macro organisational level, we're going to see things like incorrect or illogical sequencing or ordering of events. Things are out of order. We're going to see things like leaving out elements of the story. They might not even tell you the setting, or there's somebody's launched into what happened and you're thinking, wait, who was there? When was it? Why did this happen? Their narratives are super simple, very, very simplified, short in length. Or it might be the opposite end where they provide you with way too much or irrelevant detail and they go on tangents and it's really hard to follow. In terms of microstructure, what you're going to see is reduced length and complexity of sentences. We're going to see incorrect word selection, so maybe making vocabulary errors, and also reduced specificity in vocabulary. So lots of sort of filler language and not a lot of detail or very accurate specific verbs and nouns. And then a reduced number of words, so reduced lexical diversity, variation of words in their narrative. That's in terms of production. Those are the production skills difficulties we're going to see. You might see comprehension difficulties like not being able to retell a story or not being able to tell you who, when, or where the story happened, or answer comprehension questions about it, or just kind of have a general gist of the story. We might see errors there. Okay, so we know we develop narratives and what they are. We know that kids can have difficulties in learning narratives, but why does that matter? Why do I care about that? Well, it has a really, really significant impact and influence on both comprehension and language as a whole, and expressive language as a whole, and also literacy. So the comprehension, the understanding of, and the ability to produce a narrative is essential in development of language and literacy in young children. So the types of things that we might see are difficulties with social communication. Imagine if you can't retell a story, how difficult it is then to engage in a conversation on a Monday or retell your favourite movie or your favourite book, and how we actually use that so much to create connection with others. If we can't talk about what happened when I watched X movie, it can be really difficult socially. We also see difficulties with social problem solving. So often it might be that they don't actually understand cause-effect relationship, or when I did this to so-and-so, he felt this way and so he did that. So we see a sort of correlation and I guess relationship between narrative abilities and being able to problem solve and resolve conflicts after they've occurred. And that's a really big thing that you see in students. And then we obviously have an impact on reading comprehension. So we know that students need to, when they start to read texts or read novels or read short stories, they need to understand how a narrative is structured. It helps to make them to make sense of the story as they read. And it also has an impact on writing. Very well established. We know students need to be able to write narratives and fictions all throughout schooling and high school. and so it can impact there. So lots and lots of areas that narrative can impact. So it's a super functional communication area that we need to consider when working with students and working with families. Any questions so far, Suze, or things that you think I should go over before I go into intervention and instruction?
No, there have been a couple of logistical questions in the chat function, but my sense, I can't really see very many people and I can't see any other questions, but you're making complete sense to me, Laura.
Okay, perfect.
So that's fine.
All right.
So now I feel like I was just feeling like you're going to get to this next question, which is all right. So what can people do? I'm thinking about the parents that are on here and perhaps some of the practitioners who are less familiar with this area. They'll be thinking, all right, yep. So what am I going to do about this? So it's great that you're moving into that now.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay, so what can we do about it? Well, we can draw on research around general principles for school-age language intervention, making our learning intentions and success criteria clear and explicit, talking to students about what we're doing today, lots and lots of repeated models and demonstrations of stories, providing students instructional strategies. So I'm going to use a story or graphic organizer when I tell my story. I'm going to use that to help me organize my ideas and thoughts, using think alouds as I create a story for my students. Oh, I know that at the beginning of the story, I have to say when, who, and where the story started. Let me think about when, who, and where my story started, or who was in my story. We know that we have questions of varying complexity. We need to be able to scaffold and extend students depending on how they're responding to us. We know generally and broadly in school-age area, for school-age language, the use of graphic organisers to organise ideas and thoughts, or to sort of plan narratives, or anything really is really important. So all these things help inform our narrative intervention. We know, again, lots and lots of opportunities for students to respond, to generate and repeat. So active and full participation from our students and our clients, not just passively sitting and listening to us do all the work. And we want to do what's called contingent facilitation. So when they make an error, what do we do in response to that? Am I going to recast it and say it back to them, or am I going to use questioning to help them get a sort of a fuller answer or correct their errors, right? So these are the sort of general principles around intervention around school age, and then summarising at the end what we do. We also, all the way through, want them to be listening carefully, responding often, and rewarding active participation. So all the time I'm doing narrative intervention, I've got these principles sitting in the back of my mind.
And Laura, can I just say, can I reflect back to you? What's really nice about that is many teachers and practitioners and parents will be doing this all the time. A lot of this is like normal stuff. But what's nice is to know that there is evidence that this works, that this actually does make a difference. And I think that's what's helpful.
Yes, and this has come from a big systematic review back in 2008, which is a really seminal paper in the speech pathology world. A few years later, we had another really amazing systematic review, which really informed my research question and my research project, which was around the systematic review around narrative intervention and narrative language. And this paper looked at what had been published in the past and essentially came up with these conclusions that specifically for narrative, what really worked at that time was the use of graphic organisers, things like storyboards, story planners, icons for narratives, repeated storytelling within and across sessions, explicitly teaching macro structures, so actually breaking down the big overall overarching organisation of the text, and then teaching grammar and vocabulary within a narrative, right? So these things came out, but they said more research was needed. And so I went off and did my research project, and this is the paper that we published off the back of that. So the project was to evaluate the efficacy of a small group oral narrative intervention program for pre-primary children. Pre-primary in WA is foundation in the rest of Australia. It's reception in the UK, but it's also called, I think, kindergarten in America, all the different terminology. It's 5 to 6 year olds, so first year of formal schooling, sort of after kindergarten or nursery. And I wanted to look at whether this worked for this group of students. There are 3 papers that have come off that. So we've got the thesis, which you can access for free. There's the actual peer-reviewed journal in the Australian Journal of Learning Difficulties. And then there's also in the bulletin at the end of last year, I published a sort of an update and kind of a very user-friendly version of the paper and what we're doing now in the space. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go over this research study because I actually want to get to other stuff at the end around what's happened since this research study was published. I will say that there's a free 75-minute webinar on the Tracks to Literacy website, which you can access at that link along with the intervention manual and some of the teaching materials. So please feel free to download that and then watch that webinar if you want more details. But essentially what I did was I designed this kind of manualized program. I really wanted it to be easy for teachers, speech pathologists, therapy assistants, ed assistants to replicate it and use it and have all the things they needed, the scripts, the ways to cue and scaffold and the materials. And then we evaluated the effectiveness of that. So did it work for the population of students that I intended it to work for? The way that ONIP is designed, it's designed for small groups of students to be delivered over 6 weeks, 3 times a week for 6 weeks. So 18 sessions in total. And the sessions are 30 to 40 minutes. So it works really well within a school context. But other clinicians and teachers have since adapted it. I've also adapted it once a week for 12 weeks or for a term. So looking at what's covered in each session, absolutely you can adapt. It's not been evaluated in other forms, but it's worth considering using your clinical and teacher judgment to make those calls around how to implement it.
And Laura, can I say, if there are some parents watching this who are thinking, could I have a go with this? Sure, they could have a go. They would just need to know that we don't have the research evidence yet that it works that way, but there'd be nothing to stop a parent downloading it and working their way through it in a one-on-one or one-on-two situation, would it?
Yes, no, perfect. Thank you, Sue. Yes, absolutely. You can download it and use the books that are there and the sort of the lesson structure for sure. What we tried to achieve over the course of the intervention was I broke it down into 2 phases. So the first half of the intervention, I was really looking at just building this explicit knowledge of the macro structure of a text. What is a text made of? What are the parts of a text? And then the next phase was applying that knowledge to 3 well-known picture books. So it's sort of based around children's picture books. They're quite Australian in terms of the ones that I've chosen. In my other webinar and in the book, I provide suggestions on other texts that you might use. If you're a speech pathologist or a teacher or a parent, you can always email me and I'm happy to give you advice on how to select different books to suit your context. And all the while, I'm sort of pulling on the gradual release of responsibility model. It's explicit. Watch me as I do it. Let's do it together. And now you do it. So really guided their practice. There's an overview of sort of the approaches that I use. So when I teach macro structure, when I'm teaching the parts of the text, the things I'm going to do is I'm going to explicitly teach a macro structure using icons. So I'm going to break down the text using visuals. I want to use graphic organizers and storyboards to organize ideas. I'm engaging in repeated book shares. So we're going to read the book multiple times together, and it's sort of a dialogic book share where I'm going to ask questions, make comments, ask the students to make comments. So within that, I've got multiple opportunities for them to sort of engage in conversation as we do that book share. Now, there's a lot more detail in the actual ONIP, but I do, like I said, want to get to some other strategies shortly. In the microstructure, so what I wanted to do around microstructure was, well, if we're telling stories, can I facilitate grammar and vocabulary development by using more of what we call implicit facilitation techniques? So modelling, recasting, expansion, or what we call vertical structuring, which is where you ask a question, the student extends their sentence. So they might say, and then he ran, and I would say, how did he run? And they say, quickly. And you go, oh, yeah, so then he ran quickly. So the student came up with both parts using your questioning, and then you show them how to combine that. So that's what we meant. It's kind of like naturalistic conversation to sort of expand and work on grammar. So not explicit, I wasn't explicitly teaching these grammatical features because I wanted to see if I could improve those grammatical and vocabulary features without explicit instruction. There's a little bit of an overview of what we did across phase 1. So there are the icons. I had a session on each of those elements, and I had a story that lent itself to teach that element. In the second phase, I chose 3 books that I thought had a really nice narrative structure, and I spent 3 sessions on each of those books and really broke down those books, and we practiced retelling the story, sequencing them, that sort of thing. I asked comprehension questions, we created story boards together. As I said, there's a lot more detail in the webinar which you can access for free. And the purpose of all of this was I wanted to see whether this approach, this 18-session therapy approach, led to clinically significant improvement in narrative skills. So did their narrative comprehension and production skills get better? Did they get better at including macrostructure elements in their narrative productions? And did they get better at the grammar and vocabulary side of things? So I had a range of different measures that we collected using a single subject repeated measures baseline. If you want to know more about the research, read the paper. Firstly, I piloted it. So I got a group of students from one school, worked out, yep, this is feasible, and they made some good gains. And then I did the proper trial. And so there's lots of controls around that, information about how I selected those participants. I did a range of testing at the start to look at kind of the language profiles of the students. And this is what I came up with. So we've got pretty reflective of what happens in Western Australia in the metropolitan region. 6 out of 11 students who are monolingual spoke English as their first and only language, a few who are multilingual, 1 who had a history of trauma and some language difficulties. So pretty what you would see in a group of 11 students here in our metropolitan region. In terms of their language abilities, I tested a bunch of things: vocabulary, narrative, and then nonverbal IQ. And you can see a real variability and range in abilities, okay? And again, pretty reflective of what you would see in a mainstream classroom. So with that group of students, I had 10 out of 11 who were below the average range in narrative skills, and 1 who was within the average, but he was in the lowest of a whole pre-primary cohort. So they attended the therapy. And then we looked at the impact of this. So this is a lot of numbers and details. Watch the webinar if you want a better explanation. But really, as a whole, we saw 2 students that didn't make much progress or didn't make clinically significant or statistically significant progress. And that's because they were either really severe or they were in the average range. But those students with asterisks made clinically significant progress before and after the intervention. And in fact, 3 of them made 2 clinical boundaries. So that means they moved from poor to sort of moderate to average, or what else did we have? So all of those did that. So they moved sort of 2 clinical boundaries, which is a really big positive impact as a clinician over a 6-week period to see that kind of change. In terms of what kinds of students it worked better for those with mild narrative difficulties and age-appropriate receptive and expressive vocabulary, they made the most progress. So we saw the most progress across the different measures and hypotheses. So we saw improvement in overall narrative ability, macrostructure, and with some of the microstructure measures. For moderate narrative difficulties, a little bit less so a little bit more variable, all made clinically significant progress though in overall narrative abilities. And then for my students with the more severe difficulties, and particularly the one who had a really complex background in terms of trauma and development, made the least amount of statistically significant progress. So what that tells us then in that form as the ONIP was that it worked for students with sort of mild to moderate narrative difficulties to address most of those measures. It worked for overall narrative and macrostructure for our E-DLD students, so English as a second language or dialect, but not for grammar and vocabulary, and it wasn't effective in that form for children with a really severe DLD. That doesn't mean to say though that you can't still draw from that in your practice. It just means that you need to make sure you're measuring progress of the students as you work with them and make adaptations to the intervention. So potentially more intensity, more dosage, and embedding more explicit instruction around grammar and vocabulary. Okay. I'm conscious of time. I'm probably going to spend another 10 minutes. Is that okay? And then we'll do 10 minutes questioning. Yeah, beautiful. Okay. So that was that study, and that was published in 2019. and the manual is there. Have a look at it. It's got lots and lots of additional details in there. But what else do we now do around narrative? Well, there's been a lot of stuff that's come out from the literature. So there's some amazing narrative pioneers who've published a huge amount in the last sort of 10 years, including the Gillams in the States, Trina Spence, Doug Peterson, Marlene Waitlist developed Vicky Joffe over in the UK, and then also researchers in the sort of reading comprehension space and educational space who have informed my thinking around what we should do to support narrative language, all listed on the slide there. There are 2 papers that are open access, which I really recommend you access, from Trina Spencer and Doug Peterson, and then the other was from Chelsea Pearce and Trina Spencer. One is on narrative interventions, and they summarise principles for practice based on the massive body of research they've done in the last 10 years and all their studies. And then the other one is around classroom-based oral storytelling. So I've tried to summarise and extrapolate some of this, which we'll go through now in the next 10 minutes. But I absolutely recommend you download whatever is relevant for you, and they are open access, so free to source. So what can we do in the home? Well, read and tell lots of stories with and to your child. Lots and lots of stories with and to your child. Engage in what we call dialogic book share. So we're not just reading a story to our child, we're actually having a conversation about what's happening, what we can see in the picture. We're making comments, we're asking questions, and we're thinking aloud what's happening in the story. And I've got some prompts, some dialogic bookshare prompts, which I'm happy to send out afterwards along with the slides. So other ideas are things like engage in diary writing together, take photos of your child doing interesting and exciting things on the weekend, on the holidays, and then help them write that down and make a record of it and organise, you know, when, where, who, what happened, because that sort of helps to form the foundation for narrative. Model and support them to recount at the end of the day what they've done. I know this is often what my client families will say to me, like, I just want them to tell me what they did at school. Sometimes it's because they just are too tired and they don't want to talk to you, or it might actually be that they can't. So consider how you might scaffold them, and there are some prompts that I'm going to show you shortly to do that. Okay, so I'm going to skip through this quickly because we're running out of time. But just to signpost that these are little posters that I've got that I'll send out around how to engage in a dialogic book share with your child. A couple of strategies, the peer and the crowd prompting strategies. All right, in the classroom in general, what do we want to do? Well, we want to make sure we are using a knowledge-rich curriculum, and we're doing that to build a lot of background knowledge for our students on topics, but also on how text and stories work. And so we do that by including multiple texts that follow the same pattern. So we might have lots of fables or lots of fairy tales or lots of journey stories. We want to include us reading complex text to students. So not just about animals and feelings, but actually about a range of different character types and themes and plots. So they hear more complex language and we support them to comprehend that. We want to do repeated readings of stories. So hearing a story 2 or 3 times, really, really beneficial for children, particularly picture books. We want to do close reading. So let's analyse this part of the story. Let's talk about the character. So we're going to zoom in and out of a story as a classroom teacher. We want students to retell and summarise stories that we tell them or that they read. And then we want to embed grammar and vocabulary instruction throughout. And all the way making sure that before we get them to write a story, we get them to practice telling that story orally. So oral language precedes written language all the time. But let's unpack 11 principles of oral narrative intervention and instruction that I think are really, really important for us to understand. So this comes from those 2 papers, but also my own clinical experience and research experience, but what I think we need to know. Okay, so there's 11 principles there, so let's talk through them. Principle number 1 is that we want to use metalinguistic and explicit instruction. That basically means talking about talking. We talk about the narrative. We want students to say a story is made up of a beginning, a middle, and an end. In the beginning, I say when, where, and who. The middle of the story, I've got an initiating event. That's usually a problem. This is the language we're going to teach them, and we want them to actually say back to us and really understand. So how we do that is by using things like icons, explicit scripts, graphic organisers like Story Trains or Story Mountains, right? So I'm sure lots of us are familiar with this, but these things are essential and they work. We also want to go, when we teach this structure explicitly, what the Gillen say is whole, part, whole. So, or what Jenny Baker said, extract the skill from the game, but put it back in the game when it's accomplished. What that looks like in practice for me is I start the session by saying stories are made up of a beginning, a middle, and an end. Let's talk about all the parts, and we label and name them all. And then, but today we're going to focus on character or the who, or today we're going to focus on joining words. And then we have a mini session around that. And then at the end of the session, now let's have a go at telling a story and make sure we talk about who, and we have our nice joining words. So we're going whole, part, whole all the time. We're not just doing narrative in isolation. Really, really important, because it's that causal and overarching schema and structure that we need students to develop, not just an isolated understanding of feelings. Okay, principle number 2, lots and lots and lots of repetition within a session. So listen to me do it, let's do it together, let's take turns to do it, let's do it as an imitation, now you do it as a partner. As much repetition as you can do in a session. We're going to repeat stories a few times across sessions with some variations, so not imitating the story verbatim. And we want lots of opportunities for students to come up with their own stories or generate ideas using picture prompts. So I'm likely to do all of that within one session. So we're going to learn one story, do whole, part, whole, and then we're going to do some generation. So I start generation as early as 3- and 4-year-olds because I want them to create stories in their mind. So what you'll see in the Own It, for instance, is that I've got the same book over 3 sessions, and each session we're doing something slightly different with that story, and we're practicing retelling the story. So I'm increasing my expectation as we go. Principle number 3, use model or mentor texts. We start with simple stories and then increase complexity over time. The things you want to consider are like, are they a simple sequence? Are they repetitive? What's the character? How does the story structured? You can source things from TV shows, fairy tales, nursery rhymes, picture books. ChatGPT is my new favorite friend. You can prompt it to create stories on whatever, Minecraft, whatever, crocodiles, whatever the special interest is. So definitely have a look there. In the Spencer and Pierce article, they talk about how to sort of push the preschool, kindergarten, which is nursery, or kindergarten here. No, it's not, other way around. Preschool is nursery and kindergarten in WA. So how you kind of scaffold and push from a simple to a more complex structure. But I also just want to promote a fantastic website in Perth from a Perth-based speechie called Bookshare Time, where a speech pathologist has actually identified what kind of structure different picture books follow. So you can actually search for books that have a problem resolution structure or a sequencing structure. So really, really fantastic website from Cecile Ferreira. Okay, principle number 4, start with retelling a story first, then move to students telling stories of their own, of things that they've experienced, their personal narratives, and then move to fictional generation. This might be across a number of sessions or weeks, or it might even be within one session that I do all 3 of these things with the client. Depends on their age and what my goals are and what they can deal with. Principle number 4, and I think this is a really important one, is that we're promoting what we call generative narrative language, not memorization. So I'm not rote learning a story from beginning to end. I'm not imitating for weeks on end. It's about listening to a story, retelling it a few times, moving on to the next story that follows the same schema or pattern. Because the goal we're trying to achieve is for students to develop a narrative type language, a narrative schema, and they do that with lots of different examples. And so in fact, in Story Champs and with Spencer and Peterson, they recommend not repeating the stories really at all. I find in practice doing 2 to 3 repetitions sometimes is needed. So how do they suggest we do that? Model different stories in consecutive lessons. The goal is to teach the patterns of storytelling. And when you repeat a story, you're increasing expectations. We're adding more complex vocabulary. I'm varying the sentences I'm going to use with my students. I'm going to add a bit more into the story. There's a purpose behind it. Principle number 6, use lots and lots of visual scaffolds, so icons, graphic organisers, pictures. Principle number 7, we then want to fade that scaffold over time. So this is, again, from Spencer and Peace, really fantastic visuals. So we start by telling the story with pictures and icons, then remove the pictures, so just the icons, and then take it all away and see if they can internalise that structure and therefore generalise it outside of the clinical setting or classroom. I've also got in the Own It specific sort of scripted ways in which you can prompt them. So principle number 8 is include effective and efficient prompting. How am I going to respond if they make an error, or how am I going to expand what they do or say? Spencer and Peace do even a better job at simplifying it. 2-step process where if they don't have a macro structure element, I'm going to ask a question, then model it for them and ask them to repeat it. Or if there's a grammar error, I'm going to model what they need to say and then they repeat it. So super, super simple routine that you can use that's not going to take up much time. Principle number 9, you want to be really strategic with the language that you're modelling to students. So when I start with, say, teaching the critical triangle, the problem, feeling, plan in my story, I say, whenever we do this, we're going to say, suddenly he felt, so he decided to. So suddenly a spider came down from the roof, he felt frightened and hysterical, so he decided to throw his hands up and run out the door, right? So you decide, and then once we've got that pattern, then we vary the structure a little bit. But I'm being really strategic about the language I'm modelling for my students. And then the last 2 principles, practice storytelling outside of the session. So we're going to do this in a classroom setting, at home, in the clinical environment, through play, acting out new stories, getting students to talk about things that have happened on the weekend, any opportunity that arises to get them to practice storytelling to generalise that structure. And then the final principle, which I think is really important, is to also include non-fiction text structures alongside that. So say if I'm doing possum magic as a text in WA, they eat lamingtons, and so we might have a go at making lamingtons, or we might make Vegemite on toast or something, and then I get the students to retell that procedure. So consider aligning some non-fiction text structures alongside that. Okay, I feel like that was a massive whirlwind. I've got a slide here on some assessments that I really recommend using. I've separated them into in-school and in clinics. My main message is just assess narrative, make sure you're tracking progress. There's a fantastic, some fantastic free tools available, and maybe there might be some additional ideas on that slide that you haven't seen or heard of before. Absolutely recommend assessing. And then I've got a bunch of slides where I've got recommended resources. As much as possible, they are free resources, and I've identified them as tier 1, so that's the classroom or core instruction. And then I've got tier 2, so small groups, and then a bunch of tier 3 or individual, that's a specialist intervention. Some of these are paid for, but they are things that I think are fantastic out there. And then there's some other resources that I just pull on all the time in my own clinical practice that I highly, highly recommend, including things like YouTube animated series. These are all free, amazing to prompt narratives in stories. This is a fantastic pack. I don't know who the speech pathologist is, but she created a little pack of problem-solving prompts that go along with 31 wordless videos. And so I use this all the time in my practice to help students generate stories. And then just some other ideas in terms of having toys, books, all sorts of things that I use in my practice. I hope that helps. That's it.
Whoa, that was a whirlwind, Laura. So perhaps, I know. Perhaps you want to stop, that's it, stop sharing the screen. And what we might do is people who feel comfortable could either put their videos on or at least take their microphones off if they can do that. Perhaps we'll give you a round of applause to start off with for getting through about like 6 hours of stuff in 50 minutes. So yay! Well done.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay.